So I want to simply start by thanking the Bildner Center for hosting this event. There's a wonderful series of programs that the Bildner Center does. Probably most of you are already aware of them, but also in particular the Mexican Studies Group, of which Araceli, Brian and I are all longtime members and beyond. Co-founders. All right, we'll give ourselves credit here. And it has been a wonderful and vibrant run, which I see is continuing to run, which is wonderful. And I do encourage you, especially folks interested in Mexico, to keep on a lookout and to most definitely get onto the mailing list of the Bildner Center so that you are made aware of the various events related to Latin America, and in particular our subset here on Mexican studies that has been quite lively over the years. So anyway, it is wonderful to be here today. My name is Eric Zolov. I'm an associate professor at Stony Brook University on the eastern shores of New York. And I teach Latin America and Mexican history, popular culture there. And I'm very pleased to be here today because I've known of this book in the works over the last few years, and I've known in particular of Brian's work, his dissertation work, out of which this whole project has evolved. And so it's exciting to see this come to fruition, and I've had the real pleasure of reading it feverishly over the last couple of days when I received it in the mail. And it's wonderful, as you'll hear from us, and this is an exciting moment. So what I'm going to do now is briefly give a quick intro to the three of us here to my right, the three panelists, and they will speak in turn, and then I will say some words at the end by conclusion, and then we open it up and take it from there. So, first person on my far right, your far left, is Katherine Man Thorne, who's a professor of modern arts of the Americas here at the Graduate Center, who has written extensively on the relationships between the United States and Latin America through the arts, especially during the 19th century. She has a book whose title is just wonderful. I'm going to track this down. Tropical Renaissance, North American Artists Exploring Latin America. And has recently curated, I guess, the Caribbean exhibit at the Museo del Barrio. We're involved in the Caribbean exhibit at the Correo del Barrio, which I'm not aware of, but that sounds fascinating as well. And has a recent book. She has a number of writings and has done a number of curatorial work and other kinds of events. But she has a recent work called Fern Hunting Among These Picturesque Mountains, Frederick Edwin Church in Jamaica. And that's wonderful. My knowledge of church in Latin America is from a wonderful essay by Deborah Poole, if you're aware of, and just fascinating insights as an historian, that is, the ways in which art gives us this portal of all sorts of new vantage points of thinking about the gaze in that relationship. Next, let me just briefly introduce Araceli Tinajero, one of the co-editors of the volume, who's a professor of Spanish at the Graduate Center here in City College, author of a number of books dealing with Latin American modernism and cosmopolitanisms. Most recently, a book forthcoming, or perhaps already in the works, essentially out. The Orientalisms of the Hispanic, in the proofing stage, Orientalisms of the Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian world, along with several other titles and co-edited works dealing with Cuba, Latin America, and the Asian, Latin American, Asian Mexican connection. And she is, as we said, also a co-founder of the Mexican Studies program here through the Bildner Center. And finally, Brian Freeman, who is another co-editor of the volume here, received his PhD at the Graduate Center about a year ago with a dissertation, The Transnational Mechanics, Automobility in Mexico, 1895 to 1950, and has published several works in addition to the one that's in the volume dealing with automobility in Mexico. Let me just read the title, a couple of these titles, because they're just great. He's a very great writer. So, La Carrera de la Muerte, Death, Driving, and Rituals of Modernization in 1950s Mexico, and Driving Pan-Americanism, The Imagination of a Gulf of Mexican Highway. So has published some really interesting stuff on that, and is currently visiting assistant professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University across the river, and has done various stints in Mexico as well as a researcher and professor. So that's it. Without further ado, I turn the microphone over to Katherine.
Good afternoon. I'm extremely honored to be here commenting on this very recent addition to Mexican-American studies literature. Araceli and Brian are truly to be congratulated, I think, for the outstanding job they have done compiling this volume, which is certainly chock full of great ideas and information. And I think it's unquestionably going to stimulate a lot of new research and teaching in ways that I think we're only going to be able to touch upon today, because as you just heard, the book is literally just hot off the press and we all just received it. But those of us who have ever worked on a collected volume like this know that there are both joys and sorrows. So I just want to say I think that it's paid off, that this is a really wonderful addition. So this event today, I think, is really a launch in the best sense of the word, because we're kind of sending the book out there, and we'll be following just how the content really plays out. As an art historian, I'm going to focus primarily on the visual dimension of the volume. I just zeroed right in on the ones that have the pictures. So to start, I want to show you this key image by Frida Kahlo. As you can see, as probably familiar to most everyone here, but the bifurcated composition with Mexico on the left, the United States on the right, and Frida mediating between them provides a kind of visual embodiment of the concepts that open Araceli and Brian's introduction. They start with the American journalist Gruning, who recounted an imaginary journey across the border from the United States into Mexico, and actually the passage they quote was only written 3 years after Frida's painting. He writes, "Swift-moving, mechanized pattern of society in the United States, which gave way to a simple, less regulated, earlier stage of development in Mexico." So although Mexico by the 1930s has certainly experienced technological transfer from the North Atlantic economies in which they're engaged, still the stereotype prevails that Mexico is associated with tradition and folklore rather than technology, progress, and modernity. So this is the stereotype that the book attempts to complicate and break down. The great Mexican graphic artist José Guadalupe Posada lived through massive changes in Mexico as it underwent transformation into the 20th century. Streetcars, railroads, automobiles, all of the different elements that are discussed in the book become part of life in Mexico City, and naturally produced great anxiety, as several of the authors discuss. So when people are anxious, of course, they make jokes, and they try to get at the nature of what it is that's making them seem fearful. So here we see Posada deploying his famous calavera, thinking on the right about giving visual form to the everyday, to the railroad, and on the left, and on the right, to these accidents that are occurring all over the city as you get slow-moving people and vehicles, faster-moving vehicles. All these things are causing a great deal of confusion and chaos. So the road to technological progress, Posada is basically saying, is not easy and requires people to be educated and to get used to a lot of these new changes. It was always filled with ambivalence. Several essays in the book reference the railroad in the 20th century, and I just wanted to step back in time a little bit to the late 19th century. One of the things that I appreciated about the book was that it really got me thinking about the idea of a prequel. You know, we could do the technology and art and culture in Mexico in the 19th century. But anyway, so here you can see the great Mexican landscape Velasco in the screen compared to a painter based in the United States whose name is George Inness. So this is just one comparison here, but I wanted to bring up a study, a kind of classic study in the field of at least studies in the United States called The Machine in the Garden, in which Leo Marx really addresses this whole question of the confrontation between nature and technology and all the different elements that come to the fore. So you can see, again, just by taking the Mexican painter Velasco and setting up this comparison with Innes, we can immediately pick out some of the differences. Innes, for example, is interested in that idea of the stump. You can see in the front of the, in the foreground of his image, the axe-cut stumps, which are, the trees are cut down to make way for technology. There's more. The train in the Innes is more kind of tucked into the landscape, more accommodated into the natural scenery, whereas Velasco is coming right straight out at us, a bit more aggressive, and not as readily accepted, perhaps. And we just want to remind ourselves, of course, that this raises great differences when we start to think about Mexico and technology. We have to really educate ourselves about what that means in that particular context, as this book does. I mean, it starts out with definitions of technology, and all through the book, the different authors are addressing what it is they mean and how they're working with that idea. Because, of course, in the United States, you can see these are two photographs taken when where the Transcontinental Railroad met in 1869. So already in the US, you have an extensive railroad network that covers the country from East Coast to West Coast. Whereas in Mexico, of course, here's a map of in 1879, or just around the time of Velasco's painting, and the idea, again, that it only goes from Mexico City to Veracruz on the coast. It's just this one segment. So the whole idea of what the railroad means in these different contexts, we have to be sure where, we know where the context we're talking about. So anyway, just to show you this picture on its own, because it's really quite amazing, just the whole idea of the mountain landscape and the railroad emerging out of that, but also, as as you can notice, the vegetation in the lower left-hand corner, again, isn't the kind of thing that's going to be growing up in the mountains. So he's suggesting this idea, again, of the kind of descent of the railroad, or the movement of the railroad from the central plateau down to the coast, perhaps. Anyway, so here you can see also the one of the authors in the book, John Martz, discusses Guillermo Kahlo's photograph of the Mexican railway and the bridges. And here again is just another example of that type of photography, and another painting by Velasco. So again, exploring the role of photography itself as a technology and its role in documenting the growth of technology. In a way, Porfirio Díaz straddles this whole topic, the bridge between the 19th century and the 20th. And at the end of Marx's chapter, he addresses the question of the celebrity of the president and the roles that the technology played in that. And I think here, in this particular case, this figure is interesting, as the Porfiriato extends from 1876 to 1911 into the birth of motion pictures. And so this essay, I think, is very helpful, too, in thinking about the idea of film as well as photography in relation to this idea of mobilizing the image of the president in this in modern era. Tina Modotti is another figure that Marx is, am I pronouncing that right? Marx? Sorry, also argues that the work of Tina Modotti was particularly concerned to represent the modernization of Mexico in the 20s. And here you can see one example of that, photographing everything in her, that she sees, industrial complexes to telephone wires. And again, thinking very, I think, in an advanced way about the role of telegraph and telephone and how they help to transform issues of communication. And then again, using the photograph, which itself is another medium of visual communication, is actually, this essay really teases out a lot of the sophisticated aspects of this artist's work. The telegraph wires and the like also figure in the visual imagery discussed by Linda Klitsch in her fine essay on the Estradismos technologies. She discusses the works by this artist and others in which, as she puts it, which embed electrification directly into the otherwise empty landscape. And here I'm showing you not a work that she actually illustrates, but a work from 1931 in which you can see the oil rigs and other forms that provide this visual scaffolding to modern Mexico. So it also raises the question, of course, that she brings up of issues of foreign investment in many of these industries. Linda also brings Kahlo's illustrations into the conversation, and here you can see he conveys the kind of power of the modern machine with the monumentality and these very dramatic angles, but then also juxtaposed with those tiny little figures in the corner there that seem to add a kind of melancholy note to what might otherwise have been thought of as a kind of celebration or idealization of technology. And finally, of course, you can't really have this conversation without mentioning Diego Rivera. And this is the famous image of the man as the controller of the universe. This is not the image discussed in Ana Indich Lopez's essay called Technology, Labor, and Realism. She focuses on the Ministry of Public Education. But I thought for the purposes here, since it was a copy of the work in Rockefeller Center, that it might serve to be a kind of reference point for us. But as Ana writes, overt machine age imagery is atypical in the work of the muralists in general, that we don't readily associate this iconography with the muralists. So this points to the ambivalent role in the broader critique of modernity. So I think that's important, this whole idea of ambiguity. We're not necessarily saying any of these artists are pro-technology or anti-technology. There is a kind of ambivalence in all of these things. But as you can see, as you're looking at it, for example, on the lower left, the X-ray, that image of the skull on the screen, and I think Ana very nicely brings out the idea of optical technology and the kind of technology of the visual as part of what interests Rivera. And finally, just another point that a few authors touch upon but don't really have a chance to expand upon is just the whole idea of the technology of materials. And certainly Siqueiros was one of the figures who was very much in the forefront of this idea of using all kinds of more industrial paints and other things and breaking away from the traditional media in order to create these experimental works, which he did at this workshop in New York in the late 1930s, which was very influential. So many doors have been opened, and I really want to thank all of you for this volume. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. On behalf of the Mexico Studies Group and the Bildner Center, welcome to the book presentation of Technology and Culture in 20th Century Mexico. Students, colleagues, and friends, thank you ever so much. Your presence here means a lot to us, particularly in a beautiful evening of this fall. I would like to thank the Bildner Center for hosting this event. Over the last 5 years, Professor Mauricio Font, the director of the center, has been very supportive. Thanks to him, we have been able to organize several events and seminars in our persistent efforts to promote Mexican studies and scholarship. I would also like to thank our research assistants. Without the rigorous work, these kinds of events will not take place. Thank you, Jonathan Aguirre. Thank you, Jonathan. And Rosalina Lopez. And there are others. I'm nervous. Forgive me, okay? But all of you really make this place or make these events happen. I would also like to thank Cristina Gonzalez Aguirre, my student back there, my MA student who was very kind to review and proofread the speech I'm delivering today. Last week, I read with horror 2 newspaper articles. The first was about a 12-year-old girl who hid her school books under a pile of clothes and left her cell phone behind. The day before, she had delivered a message to 2 friends saying, "Goodbye forever." Then, she climbed a platform at an abandoned cement plant near her home in Florida and jumped. According to the article, the girl was the youngest member of a growing list of children and teenagers apparently driven to suicide after being threatened and bullied through texting and photo-sharing cell phone applications. I am a professor of literature. I read novels, enter and analyze texts with fictitious worlds, and lecture upon stories that go beyond our imagination. However, I cannot stop thinking about the way technology transforms our daily lives and our reality. The story of the 12-year-old girl who committed suicide reminds us that sometimes reality can be more fictitious and cruel than actual works of fiction. The other newspaper article that caught my attention had to do with the way US manufacturing jobs have fallen during the last 20 years. I'm sure this is not news to you. The development of technology has affected the jobs of those who work or used to work with metals, plastics, machinery, chemicals, petroleum, transportation equipment, clay, glass, cement, paper, furniture, computers, printing, etc. The US economy lost a greater percentage of manufacturing jobs in the 2000s than it did in the Great Depression. With that said, it is imperative to examine how technology not only transforms the economy, but also the culture of our society and our daily lives. The book, Technology and Culture in 20th Century Mexico, emerged out of an interdisciplinary seminar in 2009 on civil society in Latin America, designed by the late historian Alfonso Quiroz and me here at the Graduate Center. In that course, I had several fruitful conversations with then doctoral student Brian Freeman, which led us to contemplate the lack of scholarship on the connections between technology and culture in modern Mexico. As a result, we decided to edit a book that will examine the many ways that technology itself is both shaped and shapes culture. To accomplish such an ambitious task, we contacted historians, literary scholars, social scientists, and cultural critics, both from Mexico and the United States. Today, I would like to present to you the context of the book so you have an idea of the broad range of topics covered. Most of the images that I will be showing you are part of the book, others are not, but I'm using this to illustrate the themes. The first part presents essays on health, food, and the household. It presents the implementation of a culture of hygiene, the adoption and use of the modern refrigerator and blender, and the ways in which household technologies transformed the culture of Mexican housewives. The second part deals with photography, television, and the internet. It shows the photographic technologies during Mexico's 20th century, the development of television from 1950 through 1970, the culture of television, and the emergence of and spread of a cyber culture. This last chapter was written by novelist and cultural critic Naive Yeya, who's here in the audience today. The third part focuses on radio and music. The first article reconstructs the relationship between early radio programs and intellectual circles. The second makes a connection between music, mass media, and cultural resistance. And the third presents the introduction of indigenous radio broadcasting by the Mexican state. Railroads, automobiles, and the metro are the subjects of the fourth part. The first chapter of this section makes a connection between film, mechanized transportation, time, and space in silent films. And the following chapter examines the changing uses and meaning of the automobile in the first decades of the 20th century. This chapter was written by Brian Freeman. And the third concentrates in the country's railway system, and the fourth studies the subway in Mexico City. This was written by novelist and one of the most important Mexican critics nowadays, Juan Villoro. The last part examines the use of technology in literature, art, and architecture. Professor Man Thorne already mentioned the works or the chapters by Professor Klisch and Indis Lopez, but I'm going to repeat this again. The first chapter of this section was written by art historian Linda Klisch. She's here in the audience. Linda, hi, thank you. She studies the depiction and meaning of technology in the work of post-revolutionary avant-garde writers and artists associated with the Stridentista group. The following chapter was written by an art historian as well, and also the chair of the art department at the City College of New York, also faculty here at the Graduate Center, Professor Ana Indis Lopez. Thank you, Ana. Here, she examines representations of modern machinery in Diego Rivera's Secretaría of the Educación Pública murals, as well as the broader relationship between technology, workers, politics, and realism. In the third chapter of this section, literary critic Eria Veteranta, she's here as well, Eria, hi, studies narrative responses to technology in Mexican literature by examining the works of contemporary writers Cristina Rivera Garza, Nayuyeya, she also comments on this cultural critic, who's also a novelist, and Carmen Buyosa. And finally, Edward Burian studies the tensions between Mexican building practices and changing architectural paradigms from the 1968 Olympic Games to the beginning of the 21st century. Editing this book was not an easy task. And I could have not done it alone. Technology and culture in 20th century Mexico is the product of teamwork, close collaboration, and interdisciplinary dialogue. It is a book that not only teaches us about the past, but also makes us more aware of the role of technology in our daily lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been an interesting experience editing this book. As you know, my colleagues have already mentioned, trying to figure out how to get scholars working in different fields all sort of into one book in any kind of coherent fashion is not particularly easy. But I think that, of course, we'll have to wait and see. But I think we've been relatively successful at the effort. And of course, I owe quite a lot to Araceli for all of the incredible work. And of course, I have learned quite a bit from her in this process. So thank you very much, Araceli. And thanks as well to the Bildner Center, because we really started this project here at the Bildner Center. And so we really owe the center quite a lot for providing us with this forum. So I'd like to make some comments sort of about historiography, right? The treatment of technology in recent historiography or not so recent historiography, and make a few comments as well about why it seems that there has been not a lot of work done on history of technology in Mexico, right? We've already heard had some suggestions, but I might try to provide some indications of why that might be. So recently we've seen an explosion in mini explosion in studies of technology in the field of Mexican studies, right? And this has been across disciplines. We've seen this among art historians, we've seen this among literary scholars. Of course, a book that was quite influential for us when we were designing this concept of a study of technology and culture in 20th century Mexico was the book on the technological revolution by Rubén Gallo, right? I don't think that's the title of it, but it's along those lines, that looks at the response to technology in art and literature in the early part of the 20th century after the revolution. And so we've seen studies of technology in a lot of fields. In history, in recent years, we've seen very innovative examinations of the development of a culture of patenting innovations, right? A study of adaptation of inventions, maybe from abroad to local domestic environments, right? We've seen examples of rigorous studies, sort of re-examinations of the process of technology transfer, moving away from very traditional, crude sort of studies that look at a sort of point sort of A to B transfer, direct transfer of technology, and looking at a more complicated exchange, right? We've seen in things, and of course some of these rear their heads in the book, right? We've seen some very interesting work on the history of cooking technologies, right? Everything from the industrialization of the tortilla to the spread of refrigeration in Mexican households. And much of this is really within the last 10 years. We've seen this proliferation of these sort of studies. We've seen studies of the sort of popular technologies like sewing machines, right? Their influence in the countryside, right? This is one of the earliest technologies of the sort of the late industrial revolution, if we can still use that term, that spread dramatically into the countryside in Mexico. And in many ways, this builds off of an earlier history of technology, kind of paved by historians of film and now photography, cinema. And now radio as well has emerged as a very dynamic field of study. We've seen, and of course in this book we have an examination of some of the unintended consequences of the adoption of radio in the form of indigenous radio, right? So in any case, there's quite a bit going on here. In my own work, I've looked at the history of mobility, right? Drawing on some of the older histories of railway transportation that were so influential in the 70s and 80s. And of course, beyond the field of history, we have in literature and art a mini explosion in the study of estudiantismo, right? The sort of technological enthusiasts of the early post-revolutionary era. Now, this is, I would suggest, a relatively new phenomenon, right? Our increasing interest in technology as a theme of study in Mexico. And so I think that we kind of behooves us to sort of ask the question, why has technology not been studied thoroughly in the past, right? And among historians of Mexico and other scholars that work on Mexico. And I would suggest that if we look at the history of technology as a field, right? Obviously painting with very broad brushstrokes and generalizing somewhat. History of technology as a discipline has long exhibited a North Atlantic bias, right? History of technology has long been synonymous with the history of Western Europe and Anglo-North America. As David Edgerton has observed, history of technology has also long been simply the history of invention, right? So who invented the airplane? Who invented the automobile? These kind of stories. These don't they leave out the complex stories of adoption, adaptation, use, and reinvention, right, in this dramatic process of exchange during what economic historians have referred to as the first era of globalization, right, in the late 19th century. So there's that sort of examination of the actual field of technology, history of technology, or studies, technology studies. But I think if we look at, and I think Eric might have some comments on this or a response, if we look at the Mexican experience itself, if we look at the emergence of a modern national project in the late 19th century and in the 20th century, I think we can find some hints at why technology has been so poorly studied. The state, in many ways, participated as an active builder of an anti-modern mythology, right? We see this in the classic popular cultural imagery, right? The construction of regional, as Pérez Montfort, one of their contributors, would call these regional stereotypes, right? And these have been central to the construction of the modern nation state in Mexico. And so in some ways, I think that the myth of Mexico as an anti-modern place, or a space less technological, is we have to look at the activities of the state as well. And I think that if we take one example, the emergence of modern tourism, right? This is a project that was both informed by highly modern developments, infrastructure, free time, right? Roads, communications, industrialized printing technologies to spread around imagery, to market the country abroad. This was, of course, actively promoted by the state in conjunction with private forces. And so where am I going with this? Well, in the years after the revolution, many of these dynamics came into their own, right, in the 20s, 30s, and beyond. And this was precisely when many US academics became very interested in Mexico. And many latched on, I would argue, to some of this mythology. And you find it very clearly in the work of such important scholars that, that we continue to draw on, like Frank Tannenbaum, and one who isn't used so often, but was very influential at the time, Stuart Chase, who wrote a book, Mexico, A Study of Two Americas, almost sort of a textual representation of the Frida Kahlo concept, right, of two Americas. These are separate, right? Fundamentally, they're binaries, right? And I think that has had a very durable legacy, and we're just in this this moment of dramatic technological change, we're beginning to reconsider some of our assumptions about Mexico's past. So I'm just going to leave it at that and let Eric make some comments. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. Actually, that brought to mind some thoughts, so I appreciate that. Well, first of all, let me just start off by saying that this book confirms the very age-old adage that you cannot judge a book by its cover. And that is the only negative thing I'm going to say about this book, and it is absolutely no fault of the editors or the authors. And I guess it really is just meant as a push to go beyond the, blinding postmodern aesthetic sensibility we are in now and return to the book itself. It's a really, it's a fantastic collection. It's always daunting to read an edited volume, much less having to present or review an edited volume. But in this instance, it was a great read. And I think I mentioned in the beginning, my only regret is that I only received it recently and didn't have enough time carved out to read it, but it's the kind of, I want to keep reading, basically. It's really wonderful. So let me say a few things about why it's wonderful and to encourage you to pick up a copy, I think at the door, for about the special price of $30, which is actually not bad considering the price of a book these days. And, if you wait a few weeks, maybe you can get a used copy. No, you got to get your new copy. And by the way, yeah. And maybe in paperback, is there any?
Hopefully.
Yeah, but $30 for today, $30 is basically the price of a paperback. I mean, if you were to buy it today here, so get your paperback, price for this much larger value. And I also want to just mention that you have now 10 minutes and ticking if you want your last bit of coffee or treats. And those little chocolate churro things are really good, by the way. So this book, here are the various reasons why it's great. What I loved about it is that it brings together, first of all, senior scholars, and I use that word, with all reverence and generosity, as well as junior scholars, folks such as Brian's own work, but others who I just experienced now, hot out of the dissertation phase, or certainly starting off, along with really well-established folks. Joanne Hirschfeld, who's in this volume, John Mraz, we mentioned before, the late Carlos Monsiváis, Juan Biordo. I mean, there are a number of people who have written on Mexico, broadly speaking, broadly defined, who are in this volume, and really, it's just such it's a really nice situation when we find the junior and middle-tiered scholars in conversation with more established scholars. So that's wonderful. It's also wonderful because it is just wrought through with interdisciplinarity. This is a very, very interdisciplinary volume, as you can see from the kind of nice subject divisions that Araceli presented before. You have historians dealing with questions of popular culture and political economy and technology, meeting art historians, meeting literary scholars, meeting film historians, architectural historians. And what unifies this whole project is that all of these essays deal explicitly as a sort of thread, a coherent thread, unifying thread through their individual essays with what technology means in their particular discussion. So there's a real coherency to this volume that you often don't find, or it's somewhat rare with edited volumes, and it really seemed to work here, that they're all dealing with their topic, and in some cases dealing with the topic that they've written on. So some of these folks, Hirschfeld and Mraz and Burian and others, have discussed these works, but they're giving it a twist. They're really kind of emphasizing the tie-in to what technology means, and I want to talk about that in a second. So that's really nice, this interdisciplinarity of it. And also, there are a number of works here which are translated into English. For the first time, I suspect, for most of them. And in any event, what we really find here is a nice north-south dialogue. Very often we get edited volumes that are, 90% U.S. scholars and, the remainder Mexican or Latin American scholars. And here there's a quite nice balance. I haven't counted it, but, it's not, the imbalance does not jump out at me. Instead, it's the real balance of a dialogue between Mexican scholars living and working in Mexican context, or certainly from Mexico, in dialogue conversation with U.S. scholars. So for all that, those reasons, it works. And let me just make let me leave it at that for the moment. So in a really wonderful sort of overview of the volume, which also serves as a really nice entree into a kind of historical and historiographical overview of Mexico in the 20th century, or the long 20th century, I suppose we could call it. Brian and Araceli, directly create this question, confront the question, what is technology, right? What do we mean by technology? Because this is such a sort of, in many ways, sort of a wide-ranging, perhaps even, ambiguous term, because it's sort of everything, and it's sort of everything, right? And if it's everything, then is it, too much? And in fact, the volume in its broad reach does suggest that, we can sort of find this idea of technology everywhere. And in dealing with that fact, or that aspect of it, they proposed this idea, and it seems convincing to me that, technology becomes this rubric, this overarching rubric that is trying to access what is a fundamentally transnational, and that's another element of this volume, but a transnational relationship between knowledge, right? Often scientific knowledge. There's a nice essay on questions of public health and whatnot. Knowledge, technological change in a kind of mechanistic sense of technology as mechanics, with demography. So technology has to do with this kind of relationship between the urban and its tension or extension into the rural, the province. So we have the demographic question, which then gets overlaid with questions that relationship gets embedded, I guess I should say, within the idea of the nation. So then we have questions of social class and gender and national ideologies. So this relationship between knowledge, mechanics, and demographics, maybe, to put it in those terms, and urbanity, right, in its embeddedness within the nation, which itself is porous, because these questions of knowledge transfer and knowledge transfer and scientific knowledge, but also the knowledge of mechanics, the can-do knowledge is so transnational. So that said, what this seems to do is that it opens up a fascinating number of questions, but also about methodological questions, right? How then, and what are the very many ways in which we can begin to study a subject through the vantage or the lens of this notion of technology, or putting a centrality in technology. And the essays suggest many wonderful ways, innovative ways of approaching this, whether it's through art or photography or architecture or the blender or the auto or light and shadow, as that wonderful image of by Tina Modotti suggests. So, and in that regard, what I liked, and there was a statement in here, I think from Linda Klitsch's, about the idea of rendering visible the technology, and it struck me as a really nice way of thinking about this, that the estradistas were trying to render visible and sort of rally in support of modernity and of the incompletedness of modernity, celebrating this. And I like that idea because I think that's what this project is about in so many ways, of sort of rendering visible the technological presence behind the sources and the topics that people are studying, and saying, hey, look, this isn't just about this. How do we, behind that is in fact this technological infrastructure broadly defined in terms of this knowledge, mechanics, demographics, triad relationship, if you will. So I really like that, and it points to the ways in which there is along with the historiographical discussion, Brian suggested that there's been a focus in the last 20 years, say 15, 20 years in particular, on popular culture as a field. It was not just in Mexico, but in Latin America. And what I like about this volume is it's pushing us to think about the technology behind popular culture consumption. So if we're talking about music, or we're talking about radio, or we're talking about food, right? Well, what role does the technological component, again, broadly defined, sort of play in all this? And does it help us or force us to think perhaps about that dialectic in more complicated ways? So let me now just briefly sort of lay out what I saw as four, and there could be more if I put more thought to it, but it struck me as four kind of overarching, or maybe I shouldn't use that term, let's say subsets within this overarching project on technology, which struck me as perhaps is relevant to think about, are ways of breaking this down that cross, what's the word, intersect with or cross dialogue with these, the organizational structure of the book itself. So one was this idea that various essays focus on the idea of technology as in terms of usage, implementation of technology. And here in particular, I was struck by the chapters by John Mraz on photography, and by Brian Freeman's essay on cars, and the ways in which, here I was thinking, the ways in which actual technology changes life, changes, it's a motor force, right, of history. And I just, let me just read this brief quote from section from John Mraz, who's a wonderful historian of photography and of visual culture in Mexico. If you haven't come across him, M-R-A-Z is his name, old gringo living in Mexico. But he talks about the introduction of the 35mm camera and how that had such a revolutionary impact. And he's talking about, in particular, how it links to the Hermanos Mayo collective, which is a very famous sort of grouping of brothers who are photographers who created one of the largest photographic repertoires in Mexico. And he says that that these guys, these Hermanos Mayos, they brought the 35mm camera back from Spain because they had been participants in the Spanish Civil War. And up to that point, everyone was lugging around these giant cameras, right? And he says that, once, and at first he says that it was rejected, newspapers, magazines said, oh, these negatives are too small, and they didn't think it really made sense, but these guys persisted. And it says once it became clear that the 35 millimeter negatives were perfectly acceptable for newspaper magazine work, the greater number of photographs the Hermanos Mayo could take gave them more possibility of covering events thoroughly. The coupling of technological advantage and the collective labor of this collective, Hermanos Mayo's collective, accounts for their enormous archive of some 5 million negatives and explains their, quote, gift of ubiquity, which Carlos Monsiváis has so appropriately recognized. So, one theme here is the way in which technology directly impacts the usage of technology directly impacts cultural production. A second theme is the essay's experience, and I think these overlap in some ways. The focus on what might be called the experiential aspects of technology, the ways in which the essays really get at, well, how does technology sort of change or affect our lives at the experiential level here? And there's one I want to just read briefly from just a wonderful essay by Juan Villoro. And if anyone, and I trust many of you have ridden on the Mexico City subway, you will so identify with this essay. But I think he really so nicely, maybe because he's a literary person, is able to capture this sense, this experiential sense. But he says, if traveling by bus is cumulative, in addition, traveling by subway is a subtraction. The experience ranges from hypnosis to trance via mere stupor. The territory is delocalized by this movement. Since its inauguration in 1969, the collective transport system, the metro and metro, has been building the story of an alternative city that both precedes and succeeds the teeming sprawl above, a sub-city where the mythical cave of the beginning unites with the postmodern god of speed. And he just goes on, and he's just so evocative in this, in a way that really captures. There's also a very nice essay discussing the idea of the transformation on the internalization of time that the railroads bring about, and the time discipline of the railway clocks. A third theme is the focus on the familial and the ways in which technology impacts family life. And there are two wonderful essays here that themselves have a kind of dispute with one another, which makes it interesting as well. One by Joanne Hirschfeld and the other by Sandra Aguilar Rodriguez on the use of, the transformations of the kitchen and domesticity through the new introductions like the vacuum cleaner and the blender and these sort of, accoutrements of modern domestic service, right? And it just really, really nicely gets at the ways and to what degree does it sort of liberate women, or does it reinscribe patriarchal, discourses within the family, and just really like its micro level discussion in that regard. And finally, a fourth theme that I discerned was this, that of aesthetics and the question of aesthetic values. And here, again, the essay by Linda Klitsch, on the estradistas was just so wonderful here. We saw some of those images before, and really nicely gets at the ways in which the aesthetic experience and aesthetic representation, I should say, of modernity struggles to kind of capture what's happening. And let me just read a little bit from her piece here. She's talking about the one writer who was sort of referenced here in Katherine's earlier remarks, Maples Arce. He defines modernity from the estradentista perspective to establish it as a critique of projects, official and otherwise, that sought to eliminate suggestions of the present age from the national consciousness by constructing the fiction of a unified indigenous rural nation. And this references what Brian was saying before, that I think there's been a kind of an antagonism or an inability of students of Mexico to sort of see the modern, right? They're kind of caught up in the official promotion of Mexico as a certain romanticized notion, a sort of distrust and I don't know, a disgruntlement with technology. And here, Kutch is sort of recuperating this moment of this celebration of technology and the messiness, if you will. In determining its vision of modern Mexico, the group touted objects such as electricity, iron and steel, asphalt, scaffolding, petroleum, motorcycles, automobiles, radio phones, horns, dynamos, gears, cables, and antennas in lieu of what Maples Arce called the, quote, romantic pottery shards, so esteemed by others, but which he considered, quote, less original than a trash can. And it reminds me, of like what this kind of comes full circle with Carlos Monsiváis, later kind of celebrating this idea of, Mexico as, chaos, right, or this post-apocalyptic Mexico, this kind of love-hate with the, the ruins of modernity that all this technology has wrought. So these are just examples that I think we find in here, and just let me conclude by saying I think it's a marvelous collection. It's remarkably coherent, and the essays are short, and I think that really works to its advantage. For one, because there's so many, so you get a kind of snapshot of taste, but it really provides a nice introduction for students, those in the know about Mexico and those not in the know but who want to know about Mexico or who might be interested in some other country, and this is a kind of entree into Mexico, because it covers such a wide range of subjects, and they're manageable, they're digestible, and it really gives the reader kind of places or hints or tips, pistas, from which they can then go on to pursue this particular author's more extensive work, or there's a very lengthy bibliography at the back of the book, other works on the subject. So it's a real great primer for this topic overall, and I think it's going to hopefully really kind of make a mark as a key reference point, I believe, for what it means to think about technology, not just in Mexico, but really in Latin America, more broadly speaking. So congratulations, felicidades.